Hello everyone, today we talk about the trading activities and the protagonism of the mercantile companies in the low Middle Ages, and we will essentially focus on the role of the Italians during this period, as the Italian merchants had risen during the golden age of medieval trade, so roughly during the 13th and 14th century, to a fundamental role in European trades and the operation of credit and loan and exchange rate and all these activities that were, by the way, all one. These were initially merchants, then eventually they evolved into bankers. We will see how it happened and how they managed to expand literally all over, especially southern and western Europe. This is a very important topic because it's often overlooked. Sometimes the Middle Ages are depicted as this kind of monolithical thing in which, I don't know, kingdoms really worked very slowly. There was no dynamism. People didn't travel. Everything was kind of locally based, and this is completely false. Today, as I've just said, we will be talking chiefly about the 13th and 14th century, that were the moment, especially up to the half of the 14th century, and the Black Death that really made everything collapse. Well, not really everything, but really changed radically the situation. Were essentially the culminating point of a massive demographic and economical expansion of the European continent that arrived to match, essentially, to recover the dimensions as a phenomenon, and also in quality of life and number of people than to Antony in Rome. We think that 14th century Florence was alone, by the way, having the same income of the Kingdom of England in itself, and it was the place in the world where that managed to top the levels of wealth, education, and quality of life of Antony in Rome. So we're talking about a huge expansion that really, encompassed the whole European territory, at least in proportion to what it had been before. Naturally, southern and western Europe kind of expanded more, but this was a great phase of expansion all over the continent, and not only, by the way, because this happened also throughout the rest of the Mediterranean. It was actually, it's a moment in which we don't have still, the 13th and the first half of the 14th century start having also lots of sources that allow us to identify something, but it's not that we kind of still already get the dual picture of the thing. Dimensionally speaking, there is still a lot of debate. If you ever studied history of economics relatively to this period, you know that basically there are a lot of information, but it's difficult to frame them into a objective system. We don't know how, for instance, how many people lived in Europe at this time. We roughly have an idea, but we can't really be sure. So aside from this swinging in estimates and all, we have to think of this this gigantic European society that at a certain point overexpanded, began to crack, and definitely collapsed with the Black Death. And before, however, these periods, so chiefly during the third and second half of the 13th century, the trade activities, financial activities, really went through the roof. Like they expanded like they have never done before. By the way, even surpassing. Before we made a comparison with the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had a much lower economical potential than 13th century Europe. It was a completely different way of conceiving trade and bank. It was a wholly different world. For instance, the Romans had banks, but they were something that really couldn't absolutely compete with the ones that were developing in the 13th century in Europe, and simply because there was a completely different way to which wealth was really administered and organized. And now these are complicated topics, so I don't want to venture in them, because I'm not going to make a comparison now between Roman times and the Middle Ages, but just to make you aware that this was something really big, and that everyone who tries to depict the Middle Ages as a dark hole that magically at a certain point came out of darkness during the Renaissance is not telling you about anything factual, historically speaking. So today we will chiefly talk about the Italians, as we were saying, because we have actually discussed already pretty widely at this point what the importance of Italian merchants and bankers was during this phase. If you are curious about this, you'll find most of this a reference to the Italians, not just in the medieval history playlist, medieval Italy playlist, but also in the medieval society playlist, especially in those videos in which I talk about medieval European economy, broadly speaking, because really Italy at this point was at the center of the whole thing. Like the whole European economy revolved around the Italian markets, and this is it. I mean, if you want to understand the Middle Ages, you have to, especially the lower Middle Ages, you have to understand this, that Italy was a giant at this time, both from a demographical point of view, because like 1/4 of the Europeans at this point were Italians. Italy was enormously populated, and also in economical power. Like Italy was, it didn't have a kingdom proper, if not in the south. That, however, was a bit different. It was powerful, but it was more resembling, say, I don't know, the France or England in this sense, as a political system. While the center and the north of Italy, that were actually the places where this trade development was taking place, were all independent city-states. Yeah, of course, they were part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it kind of won their very large autonomy on the battlefield, and this triggered. Actually, it wasn't really the triggering factor. That there were already pre-existing, obviously, reasons, but also what I'm trying to say is that the fact that the Italian cities were not eventually brought under a central power that could draw resources from them. Favored in part also their economical development. You know that in medieval history, especially I think the most recent historiographical interpretations of how, for instance, phenomena like humanism or the Renaissance spread, and I'm not talking about Italy just because it was a European-wide phenomenon, actually occurred partly thanks to these political fragmentation. This is kind of paradoxical. I mean, these studies started from from comparing, for instance, empires like I don't know, China, or even the Byzantine Empire or the Caliphates, and Western Europe, and looking at how the fragmentation of Western Europe, so the impossibility actually having a strong empire, was actually favored the rise of the local, powers, the local a phenomenon like the Renaissance, for instance. Why is that? Because basically this has been observed, especially when the Ottomans invaded Europe, that the Europeans were able, being so fragmented, to basically shift the capitals to various powers at the advance of the Ottomans, so that there wasn't a big European empire that at that time could invest all the resources it had against a huge clash against the Ottomans. It were all small powers, kind of administered, sometimes even very cynically, their own resources. Think about France, that incidentally was the largest power in Western Europe at the time, that actively backed the Turks against the Habsburgs. or but this is very much more economical as a perspective, because it's really shifting physically the capitals in places that were safer. And this happened through banking, in which the Italians now were the leaders in the sector, in spite of the development of other areas, chiefly think about the markets of the Flanders, of the Hanseatic League, partly also Aragon, definitely, and there were also other banks scattered also naturally, Italy now was really on the lead, and essentially what the Italians accomplished in accounting, in banking, was something that remained unaltered basically for most the modern age, because they had figured it all out before, and simply because they had to manage such huge amounts of wealth, of goods, to have these broad international trades that necessarily sparked their interest in accounting, bookkeeping, these other activities that now we will see. So the point I wanted to make, I guess, is that the political fragmentation of Europe really favored this, also compared to the Roman Empire. Yeah, so we can come back to the example we were making before a little bit, that all this political fragmentation sparked the dynamism of the local entities, because there were also more unstable entities in part. If you were a tiny city republic, that sometimes they weren't so tiny, in the sense that at least they were tiny, maybe extensionally speaking, they were powerful as much as kingdoms at this point, but there were still certain political upheavals, and let's say in this very, especially given that there were so many other city-states like you that were all competing against each other, everything could change from a moment to another. So also the need of security, of protection, entailed a more dedicated approach to your own resources. If you are a bigger kingdom like England or France, you are very powerful. You can do very, especially from a military point of view, you can achieve great things. But as a system, the larger you are, the more you're gonna waste energy, resources. This is a physical principle. It has nothing to do on how good you are or not. The larger you are, the more attrition you're gonna face, and the more resources are gonna go wasted. And this means, on the scale of of powers like kingdoms, that this could translate itself in large areas of your domains to grow poor, for instance, and triggering a social crisis, and causing a weakening a kind of not just of the local communities, but of the whole structure of the kingdom in itself. And it took a long time before European kingdoms could form something, in fact, pretty strong. And this often passed through the necessary social crystallization and the increase also in inequality. This is pretty evident, especially after the Black Death and the later Middle Ages, were essentially all this huge dynamism of the previous centuries that were coming from below, was coming from the merchant, from the commoners, from the peasants also. Was stopped, and there were essentially just society was the classes were crystallized. There was this happened times different times in history, obviously also in relatively different way, but the essentials from a socio-economical point of view were the same. And the Ancien regime in this sense was crystallized as we know it throughout especially the modern age, in the later centuries of the Middle Ages, as the central period, like the one we're seeing today, was instead much more dynamic. People were on average much freer, let's say, in the 13th century than in the 15th century, especially the large masses of peasants that were actually the greatest, made up the greatest numbers of the population. So this is very important to bear in mind, because sometimes even prospectively we sense things like today, that we're talking about merchants, and we think that merchants were all that existed out there. No, obviously, even if this phase, historiographically speaking, is dominated by attention towards these more dynamic classes and political entities, we don't have to forget that we are in pre-industrial times. So really, the core of the economy is really the land and the peasants who work in it. And we'll see it especially with the crack of the 14th century, how the coming back to the land was very important for European economy after this time of great financial expansion that eventually brought with a crisis to banks in bankruptcy and made a great part of these sectors collapse. In fact, even if you study the Medici dynasty in the 15th century Florence, you say, oh wow, these guys were so rich. Yeah, they were so rich, but they were never as rich, or let's say that you can argue that Florence as a system was not as rich as it had been in the 14th century. This is very important because it gives you the sheer size of the phenomenon that is important to picture as at a basic level. So as we were saying before, there were lots of transformations that Europe underwent during this period. I made a video, for instance, about which is titled, should find it into the Medieval France playlist, that is the rise and fall of the Champagne fairs, were these major economical events in Western Europe that dominated European economy, Western economy at least, Western European economy for centuries. At this time, during the 13th and 14th, was starting to essentially to contract. And the Italians were very deeply involved in Champagne fairs as well, as together with the Flemish merchants were the ones who actually shifted the goods and made them arrive in there and create this wide thing. But even with the decline of the Champagne fairs, the fundamental role of Italian merchants was European trade was always there. By the way, these Italian merchants were pretty aggressive, economically speaking. For instance, in Germany, during the Ostsiedlung, during the expansion towards the east, the local German princes kind of prohibited the Italians and the Jews to enter into their activities, trying to favor German merchants, because really the Italians at this point were monopolizing everything, and it was a serious problem of competition. This was pretty ferocious, and as it's always in the economy, so you always keep in mind also these less kind of excuse me, of edifying factors, let's say, that exist in history, and you have always to take this in mind. As you have to take in mind that the Renaissance and also the point I was trying to make before, the humanism and the Renaissance were born thanks to the banks. Now this sounds bad, because you think about recent times and all the problems that let's say illicit banking activities has brought to our economy in the past decades, and you realize that there is this kind of also of conspiracy theory about banks and all, but you have still to think that banking is something pretty natural from a in terms of business and administrative point of view. And if we have marvels like I don't know, the Cathedral of Florence or St. Peter, etc. It's thanks to banks, and that's what makes civilization, because it's basically means you have a lot of surplus, and it basically means that therefore there are more people who can be maintained to study. For instance, where do you think humanism started from, and why do you think this started in Italy? For this very reason, because that was the wealthiest place in the world at the time, and there weren't just peasants breaking their backs like in the rest of the world. There were also people who could make a living out of law, out of research, out of reading, out of history and engineering, and I also think the material dimension of this. This is the phase into which the major European cathedrals are starting being built. And so yeah, maybe I will discuss this in another video more in detail, but today let's try to stick to the strictly commercial, say, and financial point of view. So so even up to the 40s of the 14th century, the Italians had this enormous, decisive role and engagement, for instance, in the before the Black Death, essentially, that made things changing a little. The export of the English wool in Flanders and in the same Italy. The major bankers at this time were the Lucchese, the Florentines, and naturally also many other merchants coming from many other Italian cities that were also directly involved into the tax collection, for instance, in the English kingdom. So essentially these activities were subcontracted by the crown to make and carry out by these merchants that had the money and therefore the means to carry out such operations. So this is very important because you realize that also part of the lack of centralization that existed at this time in politics was compensated by these forms of subcontract, say, that were carried out and could really work as if there was a state out there. All it took was money, and this was the real problem, though, as the Italians had to lend a huge amount of monies to the Western monarchies for these equally enormous war expenses. This was actually the main problem. Throughout all, we can argue that this period, also in the modern age, the main expenses were all military ones, the ones about war, and especially the medieval crowns were chronically short of money. So guess who had lots of money? The Italians. And guess who was going to who the monarchies were going to ask for money at this point. So and this is very important because you realize that all the major conflicts of this area into Western Europe were actually founded by these Italian city republics. Also, if you want to understand the Years' War, that's all about that. And although in that moment there is already the collapse of the various, but most of the clashes between England and France, also in previous times, were actually financed in that way. And naturally, there were also other ways of financing war that, however, still had much to do with this Italian element. Because the Italians at this point were not just the guys who had lots of money, but were also the ones who know how to administer them. So this was very important, for instance, for the Kingdom of France to have counselors and advisors that knew about the international market at that point, and that knew how to make money with these contacts that they had, and these were mostly Italians, and this was a channel, mostly a kind of French-Italian axis at this point, because during the 13th century, second half of the 13th century, that the French managed to seize control of southern Italy. Southern Italy was very, very important for grain exports, because Sicily at this time fed great parts of Europe, including the rest of Italy itself, and the way the French had conquered southern Italy was through a crusade. It was financed by the Pope and the French by essentially granting the Tuscan bankers the toll, let's say the monopolium on the Sicilian grain exports all over Europe, and that this is why you find so many Tuscans out there from Florence, from Lucca, because these were from Siena, for instance, that were all the cities that had been framed, that were engaged in this Angevin system, French Angevin system, that at this point was even after the conquest of the French conquest of Sicily, kept developing as these cities were allied with France in the clash against the German emperors and the other, let's say, German-backed Italian cities, and they all interacted. They provided for mercenaries. They had a huge logistical importance. I mean, if a French army wanted to cross Italy, passing from France to Naples, say, especially Naples when Sicily was lost to the Aragonese, excuse me, that incidentally were in fact allies with the Germans and the Italian Ghibellines. Cities like Florence or Siena, etc., were huge logistical points of, on which also think of the material wealth of these cities, and think at the huge resources that, in this sense, were needed in order to move an army, and how these Italian communities could be helpful. Obviously, always getting something in return, because it's not that these cities really liked anyone interfering in their own economical business. In fact, the Angevins were quite clever to kind of making it a bit of as a soft, at least when a soft interference in the local affairs, but this Guelph bloc contributed pretty much also to the situation. I made a video that I don't remember now. What's the title is should be the material wealth of communal infantries or something like that. In the medieval warfare playlist that actually deals with that. It deals with Milan. Actually, Milan at this point was from the other side. It was Ghibelline, but or at least there was a shift. I mean, it wasn't in the fully Guelph block. So, the title of the video is Material Wealth of Communal Infantries, and that gives you the size of. It's a video in which I discuss essentially the Milanese wealth at this point, and that gives you kind of the measure of how many resources these cities had. You know, how could the Italians make it to crush the German invasions at this point? And at this point, they had won it essentially. But how could they? Because they had huge resources. They could fight. There were many. They wanted to make money without paying taxes to the Germans, or at least not all the ones that the Germans wanted, and they simply took arms, and these armies were extremely well organized, thanks to all the resources that were available into those Italian cities. And you have to think that in a time like the Middle Ages, this is something that wakes, because big cities like the were in Italy weren't really much where else in Europe at the time. So even, trying to besiege a city of the dimensions of Milan or, I don't know, Florence, it was something pretty big, and it required lots of other resources. So there was also kind of a material factor in the whole thing. Like you see Italian cities at this point start building lots of things in stone, whereas most of the European cities at this time were built in wood, and this because they had not because there were more available stones into Italy, but it's simply because there were the money to provide that material. So this is really important to understand lots of things. Most of the, for instance, of the weapons production as well at this point was an Italian monopolium. The Lombard blades were exported all over Europe. It was a kind of sort of pre-industrial scale production at this point, and the rest of Europe wouldn't reach that if not this. This kind of I mean, even in the early modern age, the Italians kept being on the lead in armor production, but it's not up to the Renaissance. And basically, other countries managed to build kind of a permanent armory production, armor industries on their own. So just think about also the ramifications of these trades and how big. I mean, if you wanted to buy, you necessarily had to depend from these markets if you wanted to be a, I don't know, a power at the time, because you needed money, you needed resources, and the Italians could provide them fast, and obviously naturally getting fatter through that, because they obviously always demanded something in exchange for. But they remained burnt at a certain point when the monarchies couldn't pay them anymore, because they had contracted so many debts that they had no more liquids. So much also of the crisis of the mid of the 14th century actually started from this. And there are people who argue that the Black Death is not something that popped out magically out of nothing, came to ravage the European world at this point, but it was rather the precondition of the economical crisis that kind of favored also poverty and misery, etc., and made the plague spreading. So this has so many wide implications. So making lots of digressions here. So you have to think of Tuscan, Genoese, Placentine operators that between the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th also had a very big role into the affairs of the French crown directly. And incidentally, I'm studying part of these relations at the time, as I'm studying much of about the French and Italian cooperation at this point. I'm studying also the German and Italian cooperation at the same time. But indeed, the role from France, that was the bigger thing now, as the Germans had basically lost the monarchy at this point, and they were all fragmented. It's a bigger system where you can study that better and see how war was financed in that fashion. So it's very, very interesting. I might talk about that also in more detail. For instance, the French also relied heavily on Italian mercenaries at this point. Even during the Flemish revolts, they brought Italian infantry from Lombardy and Tuscany to fight against the Flemish infantries. Now, this is interesting, especially for a power like the one of France that had that was mostly cavalry based. And after Courtrai, the French cavalry had been defeated by the Flemish infantrymen. So the French say, okay, why don't we bring some Italian here to fight, since they're good at infantry. Still, at least, because especially during the first half of the 14th century, the Italian infantry steadily declined in favor of the, by the way, foreign mercenary cavalries. So, but this is another story. We will talk about that in more military history-based videos. So naturally, also now I'm stressing very much the fact that these were Italians. But telling you the truth, the merchants of Italian origin, let's say that in this way, also did not really act alone. They were logically reunited in companies that were also involving other merchants from all over Europe. So we'll see that, especially when we will explain where did those enormous Italian capitals come from. I mean, they weren't coming all from Italy. They were coming also from other places, and people were interested in the activities that Italians were doing because they were quite remunerative. They were making goods, so they wanted to invest in them. So that's how big the economical crisis of the 14th century was, because it wasn't just a, I don't know, problem of relation between the English or French crown with these Lombard or Tuscan merchants. It was really about a huge amount of people having invested from all over Europe into these trade activities. However, so you have to think that, especially in the Mediterranean, into Western Europe, these companies were present all over the marketplaces, literally all over them. And the major family, it's interesting, let's talk a bit, make a list of the major Italian families at this time, were the wealthiest people in Europe. Let's start from Siena, for instance. So this lovely city in the south of Tuscany, and talk about the Bonsignori, for instance, or Buonsignori, depends how you want to write that. So these were coming from Siena, and they created the so-called Great Table of the Buonsignori. It was the most powerful bank organization in 13th century Europe. These were revolving essentially around the families, really, because the capitals were attained also through matrimonial strategies to be kept all in the same family nucleus. So that this is typical, by the way, of especially of communal Italy. This is something that, for instance, decreased much also the role, the economical autonomy of women at this point were progressively kind of also excluded from the management of their own dowries, and this had broader implications into into the local society. Most famously also the Salimbeni, always from Siena, that were extremely powerful in here between the 13th and 14th century, and these guys had made a lot of money from the grains of the Maremma area, that is in this kind of mostly country area into southern Tuscany. So this is important because it gives you a bit the dimension of how also this whole financial system was also backed by more hard, let's say, more hardware things, like in fact the agricultural production. And these guys, having made lots of money with grains, they began to invest into spices, in the silk factory, and they started building. These were enormously wealthy families that began to build palaces and towers in Siena. They had over 30 castles in the countryside, and once in 1260, during the famous campaign of Montaperti, that we will discuss surely in military history one time, one of the Salimbeni actually borrowed to loaned to the commune 100,000 florins. That is, for the military expenses, is a huge sum. And naturally, these families were also pretty much involved in the world political life of the city. Then there were the passing to Florence, that also was now at this point, especially through the Angevin channel, rocketing literally. At this point was becoming the richest city in the world, nothing less. And also in here there were several families. Now this is important to bear in mind also compared to the Renaissance. I mean, to the Renaissance there was just one family, that were the Medici essentially. I mean, all these families were there actually still, but just for telling you how the later Middle Ages were actually also more stratified. At that point, it was as if there was a monarchy in Florence. Instead, here in the 14th century, you see that there were so many families that actually ruled. I mean, often one against the other, but kind of there was one of them prevailing over the others. And in fact, especially in Florence at this time, there was a sort of so-called republican regime, because all these families had risen so fast, economically speaking, that they kind of all were at the same level and were extremely powerful. So they built up sort of an oligarchy that was really refused the idea of a lord, of a single lord to raise to power, as there were all these equally powerful, roughly equally powerful, or counterbalancing powerful, this is better definition, families that wanted to rule each one their own share. So this is also how a big difference of a big deal of European political theory was produced. I made a video that now was titled, I don't remember, but it should be also in here. It's definitely to Medieval Italy playlist. Medieval Italy, yeah, here it is. The title is Freedom and Tyranny in the Age of Humanism, Political Thought in Florence and Milan. And that's interesting because that explains this a little bit, because Florence was in this sense the most kind of republican, kind of most democratic, let's say. It was always an oligarchy, so it has nothing democratic in the way we mean it, but I mean, not nothing, but it's not fully what we mean by democratic today. But the opposite was Milan, that also had made lots of money through banking. It had lots of bankers, but was ruled by a single dynasty at this point, for reasons that now we don't have time to explain, but that we will, definitely. And it kind of shows you how there was a different political thought in Florence and Milan, based on this these political and social differences. How bad I explain things, how messily I explain them, at least. So passing to Florence, as we were saying, one of the most important families was the Peruzzi one. Now, the Peruzzi are documented since the beginning of the 13th century. These were all pretty young families. This is a characteristics of the Italian aristocracies, the Italian elites, let's say better, at the time. Obviously, in Italy there were feudal dynasties as well, but these families of urban commoners were becoming much wealthier even than the feudal aristocracy, and they were all pretty of recent ascent, let's say, because the rise of the Tuscan cities, for instance, is something that happened pretty late. It really happened in the second half of the 13th century. Like the Lombard cities were had risen, economically speaking, much before. The Angevin intervention in Italy really triggered the rise of Tuscan cities at this time. So to make you understand how not just strictly structural factors, but also political ones that are dictated by other fluctuations really can change the history of mankind in many ways. And so also this family was extremely powerful. They had towers and palaces into their quarter in Florence, in the Holy Cross quarter. And they kind of declined only with the ascent of the Medici, actually. and some of them transferred themselves into France. This was also done because these people were used to travel a lot because of their business, and sometimes they just, I don't know, bought houses in there, and you can see that easily also in London. And some of the wealthiest palaces there were owned by these Lombard and Tuscan merchants. And however, the Peruzzi are best remembered for their very wide, in fact, range of of activities between the kingdoms of Sicily, England, and France. So they basically ruled the finances of the ruling monarchies. They obtained the Peruzzi obtained in exchange certain loans. It was the here was the deal. The Peruzzi received the subcontract for the tax collection in these kingdoms, and in exchange he loaned very big quantities of money, especially to England, and so the Peruzzi were involved into the export of the English wool, of the Neapolitan grain. They also made a lot of exchange rate activities into the champagne fairs in France. And they financed the Knights of Rhodes extensively at this point. They actually made a freaking lot of money. I mean, they had a huge they made huge profits, extremely high revenues, high rates of I don't know how you say this here. I have to click always back and forth to find a damned word. The lots of profits, yeah, gains, income, earnings, as you want to call it. When they finally overexpanded. They spent a lot into Florence, also in terms of investment of Florentine expansion and building on the city. In France, at a certain point, they got their properties confiscated. This was also pretty frequent thing could happen when the monarchies didn't have money anymore. They just confiscated the capitals of the Italian merchants. This was parked, by the way, by other Italian merchants, by the way. So there was also a lot of competition, naturally, also within the same. And in France, especially at this time, needed desperately a lot of money. That's how they wiped out the Templars, for instance, or how they sacked the papal treasury in Anagni, etc. So it's a lot actually of quick to cash fast. This was the problem. It's like a bit why the reform occurred into England later in the 16th century. I mean, it was just about having to find money, because the state didn't have a permanent structures of government, or at least it had a very few and weak ones. So in order these structures were able to draw less resources than than the expenses that were required to the kingdoms, and at a certain point, not to go completely bankrupt, the kingdoms had to recur to these let's say less fair actions. This naturally had its own cost, because it's not that the French would have wished that they didn't have to do that. Obviously they didn't care a big deal, but human rights were not conceived at the time as. But however, this entailed also having different relations from that time onwards with these companies, and everything is now now it's very complicated to explain, because it should be framed in a much more extremely wide, extremely complex, and extremely complicated scenario that we can't even dream to discuss in detail in a YouTube video. So it's kind of the degree of social complexity of 13th century Europe is something monstrous. But aside from this, the main blow the Peruzzi had is when they were not reimbursed by the English kings. The English didn't have any money to repay the Peruzzi's loans. We're talking about over 600,000 florins. That, according to me, is not an exaggeration, and so they had this huge failure that also also the Angevins, by the way, of Naples, weren't able to pay them back. So this all brought to this clamorous bankruptcy that that occurred in 1340. Excuse me, I think in 1343, if I'm not wrong, and that caused a domino effect, by the way, on all the other Florentine families. So this had also had a great consequence in the same economical and political history of Florence, and that's how eventually Florence lost part of this huge wealth that had accumulated in the previous 80 years, more or less. Then another very important Florentine family of bankers was the one of the Scali. The Scali were essentially also in here operating in Italy and in France, especially in France, between the end of the second half of the 13th and the first years of the 14th century. So we're always roughly in the same age. They became bankers for the Papal Curia, so pretty good affair. And they had assigned by Pope Martin IV in the 80s of the 13th century the tax collection for the papal the papal tithes into England and Scotland. So that's where they cashed. Another very important family, actually a more important one, I don't know why we jumped this, the Acciaiuoli. The Acciaiuoli was actually originally from Lombardy. This is also interesting because we said before that Lombardy was already already well developed when the Tuscan cities kind of appeared in the financial scenario as protagonists now. So many Lombards came living into Tuscany. They kind of they changed, they transplanted themselves into Tuscany. The Acciaiuoli came from Bergamo, and they actually came there in Florence pretty early in time, actually at the beginning of the 12th century. So it's something that at that point was probably dictated by other factors, but I mean the Tuscans were rising also at that point, so also if less more slowly than what they would have done later. and the Acciaiuoli were actually involved also into local political um, clashes as well, and they founded their mercantile company actually towards the end of the 13th century as well. And they rose to power pretty fast as well, and they became bankers of the Angevins of Naples, of Pope, of the Jerusalemetan order as well, and of Edward III of England. So those were parts of those family that were involved into the crisis of the series of financial collapses that the bankruptcies that occurred into the first half of the 40s of the 14th century. And they were weakened actually also by other things, including wars between Florence and Lucca at the same time. And they, at a certain point, their creditors were also kind of harassing them, especially the church that had invested a lot into their business as well. However, in this sense, you realize how Florence kind of protected them as well. There was this kind of corporative, corporative esprit de corps, we can say, among these merchants. This is important also for the later development of political transformations of these mercantile republics. Yeah, no, we're not gonna talk about later times now. We stop to the first half of the 14th century, but the Acciaiuoli were also a very important family for other reasons in the later history of Florence, etc. Excuse me for all these sounds that kind of annoy you. Another very important family from Florence were the Alberti as well. So these were also immigrants in part. You have to think that a great deal of the growth of these Italian cities, as well as any other city in pre-industrial time, came from the immigration from the countryside. So this was a family that came from the Florentine countryside towards the beginning of the 13th century, and they made a lot of money through the trade of wool and banking, and they also in here they suffered some upheaval because of the the clashes that were occurring between the Guelphs and Ghibellines into Florence, and they kind of however stuck to the Guelph side. So here also the political orientation is important, because these were all Guelph families. I mean, some of them, among the Guelphs there were also other parties, but it's important to understand that all these families of bankers were all kind of betting at this point on the, internationally speaking, on the Guelph side, that is on the French side. Then maybe locally they fought against each other, but the whole business was about this privileged relation with the French and the trades, also because France in this sense was had at this time the Angevin Empire was huge. It stretched from the Channel to Constantinople. So the idea was that traffics with the East, Sicilian grain, Italian cities, Champagne fairs, and Flanders, Flemish markets, and English wool were all basically coming through this whole thing. Okay, so this was, strategically speaking, like what you wanted to stick to, essentially, on on a broader in international markets. And also the Alberti were quite famous and for other things in history, and they expanded. Actually, they had several detachments. You know, that these I don't know how to say that, but they had various seats around in Genoa, in Venice, and in Barcelona, Paris, Brugge, or Bruges, if you prefer the French pronunciation of London, etc. So they became also very famous humanists. So that branches, that's the word I wanted to say. They had various branches all in all these cities, etc. And there were also a branch of them that actually came from Bologna, a branch of the family that became also some of them intermarried with nobility, like certain French nobles seemingly were intermarried with them. This was important because you realize it's always been so many times in history. There is the nobleman who needs money, so what do? You marry the daughter of a rich merchant who can bring lots of money in dowry, so everybody wins. So you get money, the guys get kind of nobilitated, so this was done pretty often. They were very important families. That's how the Medici, for instance, intermarried with all the European royalty without being nobles in origin, but being bankers. And in this sense, there was also a lot of cultural... it's interesting how the cultural perception and thing was, because it was known that these were not noble of blood, but hey, they had a freaking lot of money, so who cares about that? There is also another city that was very important, that is often overlooked, that is Piacenza, that we talked a lot about especially in the videos about European trade. As Piacenza was located in this extremely important area between the Po River, Lombardy, Tuscany, Piedmont, so it was like a very important point of passage for all the goods, and the Placentine merchants in France had a very big influence at court, etc. And one of the most famous families of Piacenza was actually I don't remember whether here I'm not really sure, because I'm talking about the Corsini family, and actually the Corsini family seems to have they were actually Florentine, but I'm not sure whether they were originally from Piacenza in here. I can think of other that they came involved with Piacenza actually later in times. I don't remember now, but this was another very important family that operated in Florence, however, and it was very important because they didn't have a big deal of political influence, but they were very influential from an economical and cultural point of view. These were a family of jurists and of humanists, especially in later times. There were lots of bishops, and came also to become archbishops of Florence at a point, and cardinals. So they actually had a very important history also during the modern age, during the contemporary age, and they founded lots of very famous. There were popes that were part of it. In Rome, there is the famous Corsinian library. That's one of the most important in Europe. So you understand all people that also came from these relatively obscure mists of the Middle Ages, and that rose to be the most powerful European families in later times. So I don't know how interesting for you was this list actually, but let's try to get this done now. So as we were saying before, these companies made civilization in part. They had a structured, they had especially a centralized structure. What most political entities didn't have at this time was what these companies had. So they were kind of states within states, okay? And they could count really on very different also resources that weren't just about the capitals, but also people who were experienced enough to deal with economical and financial matters. They had, in this sense, an excellent quality of administrators, and as well as an excellent net of agents and informers. So people who actually knew everything what was happening all over Europe in terms of wars, of prices, of trades, of contracts, and all. So the myth of the Middle Ages of people who stayed close in their houses because they feared everything, they didn't travel, everything was dark and gloomy. No, this is just rubbish. These people knew in a few days everything, literally everything that was happening to Europe. Everything. And they behaved accordingly. They had an extremely highly sophisticated administration system. They reacted pretty fastly. And for instance, the Peruzzi family in 1336 relied on around 100 operators that were distributed in like 20 marketplaces everywhere. Cyprus, Tunis, Naples, Bruges, London. That in this, so you have to understand what this entailed. I mean, from an administrative point of view, it takes a freaking lot of organization to deal with all these markets at once. Merciologically speaking, there were huge advancements that the Italians were doing at this time, and so all these loans and subsides, because these companies were also subsidizing other companies as well, and carrying out all these other account and bookkeeping operations. So before we hinted at that and let's try to answer it, where did all these capitals come from? I mean, where all this money, would it actually give money to them? Because, and how, not just how they made money, but how could they have so many in the first place? Well, because much of this money actually came from business partners and associates. So it wasn't just everything that had come. I mean, originally speaking, yes, these companies had made, especially. That's the difference, the sense between a merchant and a banker at this point, because in the previous centuries these families had made money through normal trade. I mean, there were merchants who physically also traveled around Europe in first person and went there and competing, etc. and accumulating wealth. Then at a certain point they have started having enough wealth to invest it somewhere else, and they started making a lot of good incomes. Other people said, okay, you know what, I'm investing in your activity as well. And so they started having, part of the huge amount of wealth these merchants had, bankers at this point had, really derived from the participation of other people. There were also depots at this time that were made by clients with whom had been agreed a sort of remuneration with a definite tax rate, let's say. So this is just like with the bank today. Essentially, you give money and you hope that there is a fixed rate, at least by contract, that you're gonna have more, in addition at the end of a certain period, so that you can profit from that. There is also a lot of development in administration, as we were saying before. So think about double entry accounting or bookkeeping. This is all something that this started actually before the 14th century, but by that time it was already extremely developing and was really helping a lot accounting and bookkeeping, because you could see through that basically, the passive and active, the credit and debt, the profits and losses, so everything that helps you even statistically tracing how your business is doing and acting strategically in order to make to increase once again profit, making the best choices, let's say. So these financial and commercial techniques that were being perfected by the Italian merchants between the 13th and 14th century kept being used well into the full modern age. So the Italians brought this huge, in fact, much of also accounting terms, etc., still borrow many Italianisms in origin, and they were only superficially innovated, virtually also in an influent way during for centuries. So they remained essentially how they had been developed at this time. This is very important to understand how effective these systems were. So we talked a big deal about the Tuscans now, but we have to think that these were, why the Tuscans really? Well, because the Tuscans weren't really the ones who physically shifted the trade. These were mostly bankers. Those who actually made all the goods coming from the east into continental Europe were mostly the Venetians. The Tuscans didn't have powerful fleets now. They didn't venture into the seas. They didn't have this kind of direct involvement in the actual shift of goods from east to west. They were mostly money lenders. Those were instead more involved, and that naturally went alongside with the Tuscans and the Lombards were the Venetians. And naturally the Venetian Republic backed partly the Tuscan and Lombard activity, because also her exports into continental Europe had necessarily to pass through at least Lombardy. So there was also here a bit of the thing is complicated by the fact that by this time there was ongoing continuous warfare into Lombardy, so it was difficult also for trade to go safely, and there was a lot of political negotiation to try to keep the traffics work, and this succeeded anyway, because there was continuous warfare, but not so continuous in the sense that the traffics couldn't pass. These powers needed money as well to finance war, so it's very complicated. So you have to think Venice at this point stretched from northern Italy to up to Trebizond. They had these were essentially the Venetians kept open the passages towards Persia and China, and put them into communication with the up to the Atlantic ports of Lisbon or Bordeaux, La Rochelle, etc. And the main axis was still between Italy and Flanders, though. These were the most the wealthiest regions in Europe at the time. The Venetians at this time and the Genoese were especially counting on the fact of leaving opened the Asian highways, thanks to the so-called Pax Mongolica. That is this, the fact that the Mongols had managed to kept open by conquering the whole Asia, almost at least. They controlled the world traffics, and until the Mongol Empire didn't finally split irreversibly into several smaller, but they were still pretty big powers, empires in the half of the 14th century. There was they had kept opened a direct road between Europe and China and India. So this was very, very important, because for the Europeans, this meant that there was no major Muslim power in the middle that obstacled the passage of goods. Naturally, also the Muslims traded extensively with the Europeans at this point, but the main problem was how much of those money were absorbed along the way at this point. So you see, if you have one big power like the Mongol Empire, you have essentially one guy who makes paying only one time. If you have 10 different powers, every power wants to take its share, and also wants more in proportion, because it's usually weaker, so it has also more expenses, etc. Especially the rise of the Ottomans during the 14th century was something that eventually closed these highways, not just the collapse of the Mongol Empire. But the Italians enjoyed, in this sense, a sort of monopolium in the shift from goods from China to Europe. So think about the huge money they could make because of that. Usually, the Italians sold clothes, other other textiles and stuff like that. Were pretty refined. That's what the Italians had specialized mostly in working precious textile, but also exported amber, metals, and they usually came back from China loaded with silk, spices, and pearls. So it was a pretty remunerative business, and you have to think that the silk worked in the silk that came from China and the Turkestan by the mid 14th century was almost entirely absorbed. Not almost entirely, but at least hugely absorbed only by the silk factory of Lucca. So in one city you have concentrated transcontinental exports of silk, where this in Lucca it was worked and then exported into the rest of Europe. And in fact, Lucca was extremely wealthy as well. This was, as we were saying before, kept possible through Venice and Genoa. So the Venetians and the Genoese were the ones who actually brought this material into Italy, and then there were mostly the Tuscans and the Lombards that reworked them in part. And we talked a lot at this point of the relation between Venice and Genoa, but we have to keep going on in part, as their relation was very complicated. At this point was also a lot of involvement of the Crown of Aragon, as the Catalan merchants at this time were also fastly rising from Barcelona. I won't repeat myself now, but let's say that the moment of glory of Genoa and Venice had been more or less the 13th century, because especially when the when the Byzantine Empire had been conquered by the Crusaders, especially Venice had made a lot of money from that, had profited enormously. As first of all, it was the most directly responsible for the fall of Constantinople in 1204, but had got lots of possessions all over the Adriatic, Aegean, and Black Sea because of that. And Genoa also participated to this, even though because while the Venetians stuck, let's say, to the French alliance as well, even though they were a bit less sympathetic towards the Angevins than the Tuscans, for instance, because the Venetians really minded only their own business. They were not, at least at this point, they were still not involved in practice into terrestrial affairs. Genoa instead bet on the remains of the Byzantine Empire in Asia Minor that eventually would make it with the Palaeologan dynasty to reconquer Constantinople, and it started making lots of money by essentially being paid by the Palaeologoi dynasty not with cash, because the Byzantines were chronically out of that, but with Greek islands. I mean, entire Greek islands were sold to the Genoese to receive in exchange the help of their fleets. And this, during the 14th century, was because of this reason a huge competition between the Venetians and the Genoese in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Venetians had a lot of control essentially on the southernmost part of Messenia, on the island of Kythera, Crete, the Cyclades, and Eubea. The Genoese instead had lots of colonies on the Sporades, so talking about Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Icaria, and also in the Black Sea. The Genoese, especially when eventually they lost to Venice they kind of were confined a bit in the Black Sea. Not only, they were also in Cyprus for a long time, but Venice was stronger. In fact, and the Genoese actually seized Kaffa in Crimea. If you go to Crimea on vacations, there are beautiful Genoese castles there. If you go into Sudak, for instance, you have this huge, and these were all fortresses that the Genoese used for protecting their traffics, essentially. So the clash between Genoa and Venice is something I haven't really been talking much about. I've really only hinted at it many times at this point, but never fully explained. Substantially, it was a fight for commercial supremacy into the Eastern Mediterranean. As we have seen, they were pretty close and they fought constantly. You can argue that at this point the whole history of the Eastern Mediterranean, also inland, was dictated by what the relations between Genoa and Venice were about. And a bit later in time compared to our today's timeline, it's important to talk about the Kyoja War. Now, Kyoja is it was a longer war that actually was fought mostly at sea between 1378 to 1381, but it takes this name from the city of Kyoja into northern Italy that is pretty close to Venice, because basically at a certain point the Genoese managed to defeat at sea at Pola in Istria the Venetian fleet. So basically the Genoese were entering the Adriatic Sea, they defeated the Venetian fleet, and they didn't have really the resources to besiege Venice and to launch a direct assault on Venice herself. So they kind of stuck to this settlement on the coast that was pretty close to Venice. It's actually at the southernmost place of the Venetian lagoon, in order to block Venice and therefore starving it, basically. This happened in 1379, and there was a very long siege in here that it's very interesting also in military history, because it's one of the first examples of thorough use of artillery in siege warfare. And at this point you have to think powers like Venice or Genoa were also some of the most technologically advanced at the time in terms of special artillery and naval warfare, etc. And basically the Venetians managed to break the siege by defeating the Genoese at Kyoja, but they had been sensibly weakened by Genoa, so that basically Venice accepted for a peace that was not very favorable to her. It was sanctioned in Turin in 1381, and through this victory, Venice lost the territories in Dalmatia and the city of Treviso into the Italian mainland and the Venetian region, because at this point Venice was starting also slowly to expand into the Italian in terra firma, let's say. And however, the Venetians still and obviously maintained the trade monopolium, especially on the high Adriatic Sea, also because the Genoese didn't have the force to avoid that. And Genoa at this point retreated from the territories that had the Venetian territories that had occupied during the war, but it kept Cyprus, that remained for a long time into Genoese hands. And this is a very important war, because in spite it was kind of a backside not a backside, a setback. Excuse me if I say something improper. It was a setback for Venice, but Venice was a much stronger state than Genoa was, so that Genoa was fragmented among those cities, those families of bankers, and this had not made it possible to have a solid central authority. Venice was made up like that too, but the Venetian oligarchy managed to essentially create a much more solid and functional political system, and therefore, in spite of this setback, Venice was able to extremate actually Genoa from most of her eastern Mediterranean holdings, so that Genoa at this time started trading chiefly on the Atlantic route. And this also changed a lot of things. I discussed this extensively. If you go into the Medieval Society playlist, there is something about the medieval trade routes and change in medieval trade routes, and I discuss about that, so if you're interested. But so there is a trend during this period that, as you have probably understood, brought eventually to the decline of these activities. This is important. Up to Black Death, this Europe had been so effervescent, so dynamic. It is true that the Black Death was procured by lots this economical crisis, this the collapse of several banks, the contraction of the European economical system, but mostly, there had been some recession, but it had also remained pretty stable at the point. The Black Death makes this big difference. It cuts everything short. So a lot of the sheer volumes of also financial resources, etc., kind of drastically contracted. And during this time, during the 14th century, there is in fact the tendency of all these companies, etc., to tend to sedentarize and to invest mostly in real estate, chiefly estates proper, that is, lots of land. This was naturally due to the fear that had spread because of the insecurity of the markets, the fact that there had been all these big failures, etc. But there is also a great another reason for this, because this is the moment into which the same city-states had began to extend more directly their control on the surrounding countryside. That up to the 13th century was not something so obvious. So this is the moment from which, by the way, most of these city-states transform themselves from republics into seigniories as well. So this implies that there are fewer but richer families that rule the city, that control the countryside more directly, and that therefore have this more, let's say, this closer real estate to them that they can start investing from. So this is part of the process that brought to the subjugation of the local peasantry, for instance, so that living conditions kind of got worse for most people during the later Middle Ages, paradoxically. Naturally, after the Black Death, Europe kept growing. It seems that the pre-Black Death European population was reached once again only like in the 17th century, but this had, however, started to rise once again, and yet on different premises. So that the agricultural resources at this time there was a sort of coming back to the land, so that the urban, regional, and international markets were increasingly revolving after Black Death on the land activities. And so it was very important, because when the CNA's and Lucchese companies had gone bankrupt, such a big structural collapse could not be passed unnoticed. It was a kind of a wake-up call for changing certain things, and this was going along with, in parallel with, lots of other changes in European society, and it was actually a moment of instability, of insecurity. But this is paradoxically what brought the Europeans to try to build their society on more solid basis. And this is what favored that process of sectorization also of capital management and investment that we were talking at the beginning of the video, in terms of how safe this was in case of crisis. This could be in case of crisis. I mean, to have more sound investments, so less money but more properties of other kind, and this had also a big impact on the monarchies that had relied on the money of families like the Acciaiuoli, the Bardi, and the Peruzzi as well, because the party was over, kind of. Think about the 100 Years' War, how detrimental it was also from a sheerly, I mean, France went, especially in the first phase, kind of was really destroyed by this economical collapse that went alongside the war. Lots of trade routes shifted from France to, I don't know, to the Atlantic Sea, to Germany. There was a real big change into in fact, you realize that the main problem of the 100 Years' War was finding the money to do that, and this is what sparked, in part, this process of centralization of the same national monarchies that, in fact, especially in the case of France, emerged more centralized from the conflict. and that in the 15th century would rise, in fact, as some of the best, actually as the most advanced um, power in Europe from an administrative, from a centralized point of view. The Italians, in this sense, in the 15th century, kind of paid for it because they had achieved so much in the previous centuries, but during the 15th, they, especially being so divided politically speaking, they didn't manage to create something more unitary. Yeah, they had extremely advanced forms of government, etc., but these were essentially mercantile republics. So the concept of having a state, like, I don't know, like France, but even just like England, etc., was something that they couldn't really exploit. So that's why the Italians invented basically the Renaissance, but they finished to be for being conquered eventually during the same time. You're remaining actually a cultural and also economical superpower for a very long time, but kind of eventually losing it to other forms of economical development that were taking places instead, essentially into the Atlantic monarchies, and that were pushing towards a much greater degree of centralization on such large lands. Think about France, think about England, think about Spain also. So this is very important because it really marked the history of Europe in many ways, and of the world indeed. So there was the 14th century. Now we hinted at it. It was actually a moment of great distress, we can say, because there was also a lot of warfare going on. The economical collapse, in my opinion, triggered also a big deal. In part of, it brought this centralization. This is very important to remember. The Black Death kind of accelerated, for instance, the rise of seigniories, of lordships, and also but at the beginning it was such a big shock from a structural point of view that couldn't be really absorbed immediately. So this caused, in the short term, which means even more than 50 years essentially, or maybe some time less, but however it was a consistent phase of European history of great disorder. Look at the political situation there. The Iberian monarchies, for instance, had won against the Muslims in the 13th century, the greatest part of the Iberian Peninsula, but they started fighting against each other. They get, and that's the reason why the Moors survived for such a long time, again into Spain. And they got involved, engulfed into the 100 Years' War, etc. France and England speak for themselves, really. Like the French and English have surely a lot to think about in their past relations. And France was ravaged. England, in spite of her victories, like Crécy, Poitiers, Azincourt, really was a mess in interior, in the political. Aside from these victories, England was in misery in practice, and there was a collapse of many aspects also of the previous high medieval efficient system that had come from the Anglo-Norman times. Germany was a total mess. After the Hohenstaufen, really, there was just about these princely dynasties that kind of reorganized Germany. I mean, it wasn't pure chaos, but it was a great moment of wars, of confusion. There was no central. Italy was just like that. I mean, they were all fragmented. There were all city republics that actually, this is paradoxical, they managed to build something a bit larger, like regional powers, etc., but they still were they faced this enormous economical crisis. Italy was ravaged by the mercenary companies for decades. So the papacy was declining in its universalistic ambitions, the empire as well. So it was a moment of great disorientation. I mean, it was a moment of great uncertainty, and you can argue that universalism finished at this point because of this, in part. You know, the kind of with humanism already. This is kind of a more secular view of the world, because probably the Europeans, in this sense, had grown kind of disenchanted, disillusioned by what the previous system was based on, and started kind of and there was a progress into this as well, because it's from times of instability that really people try to figure out new things, and that's how the Renaissance was born, after all. But it was really a rough time. Like the 14th century is a great moment of crisis, let's be honest about this. So this really was very damaging for the economy as well, because there was war everywhere, literally, both on land and on sea. This is also very important. Like the seas at this point were, were evidently, well, maybe we'll leave this for another video because it's really a bit complicated. But let's say that there was a rise in piracy once again. There were also more political actors in the Mediterranean now. Like, for instance, the rise of Aragon was some troubling factor, especially in the Western Mediterranean, especially for the Genoese. Although, yeah, indeed the Mediterranean was still managed by Venice and Genoa de facto, and it would remain until the rise of the Ottomans. So it's really difficult actually to say how the volumes of traffics and investments was reduced. We know it definitely fell, but sometimes we don't really understand how and in which quantity. We just know sometimes about these very big collapses that are recorded by the chronicles, but we don't actually have the accounting documents that allow us to retrace everything back at how it was. Yes, we have a lot from that, because these companies produce a freaking lot of sources now. But it's still not enough. And so I don't know what to add at this point. I guess I'm gonna conclude now. But we can conclude by saying that there was a partial also refinement of finance at this point as well. Exactly, especially for preserving the economy from further collapses. You know, trying to make things more ordered, more in a more cautious way, trying to invest in more sound values, etc., and trying especially to make this whole system revolving on also on a political on a more sound political base. There was we just hinted at that before, but there was also a lot of esprit de corps between all these companies at one point, especially when they collapsed all together. They kind of these families were ruling the local cities. I mean, they were the nobility. So they kind of made laws to preserve themselves. And during this time, what you realize is that, especially also from the urban legislation, is that there were lots of measures that were aimed at preserving these companies in their activities and kind of demanding, I don't know, justice was a big problem at this point. Like if, given that it was so much war, it could happen that certain merchants were robbed, and at this point, those merchants wanted justice at this point, but it couldn't be done because the other city was enemy. And what could you do? You could go at war with that. It's not that simple, and that also requires other money to spend. So what it was tried to do, naturally there were economical blocks. I mean, there were ways into which avoiding such things, and this, by the way, refines also branches like diplomacy, because this allowed in practice to, there was a much more intense contact between the cities, was something pretty ancient, but this time was reinforced. Like diplomacy at this time in Italy starts rocketing as well. There is an increasing, even the idea of the stable ambassador is something that starts happening, and even if this had always happened, this kind of answers to a need of, also here, a need of security, of saying, okay, we always have a guy there, we don't have to send ambassadors every time, we also scope what is happening there, we keep constant relations, and we try to organize everything, so avoiding the mess starting from the beginning. But from a political point of view, internally to the cities, this equated that the masses had gotten poorer, much poorer, and the wealthy guys had kind of emerged better from the crisis. So they remained in charge of the situation because they had backed each other's shoulder at that point, and they managed to keep things in order. And so whatever, but this is important, and we will maybe talk it another time. So in conclusion, I don't add more. I would like to add more because sometimes I realize in these videos, the videos are getting very long at this moment, and I realize it's not really the best at this point, maybe for everyone, but I think I will keep in this direction. What concerns me the most is I cover lots of topics in a same video, and I fear that most of the times I don't really conclude, I actually managed to conclude everything, but I wish I added more every time, because it's really a lot of things that you realize. Today we touched the various topics like the development of banks between the 13th and 14th century. We talked about the international trade traffics as well. We kind of summing up and understanding how this changes, especially during the 14th century, shaped from economy the rest of society and politics. So these are all topics that would require really a degree for each one, and naturally I'm not an expert about them, but what I hope to leave you with is the ability to look at this phenomena as something extremely broad, as extremely varied. Sometimes I naturally speak through my standards, and I have kind of read something about these things, etc. But I realize that many people out there don't really maybe click on this video and listen up to this point without even having a great knowledge about the Middle Ages in the first place. So especially for these viewers, I hope that I can give them something to think about. Thinking about the dynamism of the Middle Ages, the complexity of the Middle Ages, and trying to finally crush these stereotypes that exist about the Middle Ages, relatively to being a sort of dark age or a hole of misery and stuff like that, that are not factual history. And this is what I want to stress especially. Because maybe, I don't know, at this point I'm maybe saying too much, but I guess that before starting Schwerpunkt, I've been seeing a lot from social networks, from people who are interested in history and get on the internet to know a bit more, or participating to certain groups that at least are supposed to discuss about such topics, etc. And what struck me the most is the complete unawareness of topics like the ones I spoke about today. And sometimes I really can't understand. I mean, I realize that I have probably, I mean, to me there is really no other way to pretend to know the Middle Ages if you don't pass through these topics. This is the point. I'm not making a point, I know these things that you don't. This is absolutely stupid and false. I'm sure most of you actually know much more than I do on these topics, especially if you clicked on them, because they're pretty niche by certain standards, although I keep them generalist. But however, I still have the picture of this more massive broader level. So if I am able to make those people change their mind and kind of making them discover these universes and etc., I think I've accomplished something. And I must be fully honest with you. Of all the fields of history in the Middle Ages I could cover, I kind of don't like economical history. But making these videos is so nice, because it's as if I started liking it myself by only talking about it. And this perhaps gives to me as well the measure of how important it is to actually get to know things, because it's normal for people to fear what they do not know, to depreciate what they do not know. Because when you don't know something, you essentially fear it, because you don't know what it is, you don't know what potentially it is, but you still want to look and sound as if you knew it all before. And instead, the truth is, we all have to learn for a lifetime, and it's not going to be enough for doing lots of things, but it's still better. And if you don't do it in the first place, if you don't understand it in the first place, I think the world will remain kind of with so many problems that maybe could be solved by simply having this other attitude towards knowledge, towards life, towards education, and so on. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.